Look at this photograph. A bride, a groom, a wedding day in 1910. It seems ordinary. A beautiful black couple dressed in their finest, captured forever in sepia and silver. But there is something hidden in this image, something that experts missed for over a century. The secret is in her hands. That bouquet she holds so carefully is not just a collection of flowers. It is a coded message, a dangerous message, meant for someone who was never supposed to be found. What was this bride trying to say? Who was she trying to protect? And why did this photograph nearly get an entire family killed? If stories of hidden histories and secret codes fascinate you, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button, because what these flowers reveal will change everything you thought you knew about this picture. The photograph had been sitting in the archives of the Atlanta History Center for nearly 40 years. It was part of a collection donated in 1985 by the family of a deceased minister. Boxes of old documents, church records, and personal effects spanning nearly a century of African American life in Georgia. No one had paid much attention to the wedding portrait. It was cataloged, filed, and forgotten. Just another image among thousands, a glimpse into the past with no particular story attached. But in the fall of 2021, a doctoral student named Denise was researching the social networks of black communities in the Jim Crow South. She was specifically interested in how families had communicated during times of danger, during lynchings, riots, and the waves of racial terror that swept through the South in the early 20th century. Denise had spent months poring over letters, diaries, and photographs, looking for patterns that historians might have missed. And one afternoon, while scrolling through digitized images from the minister's collection, she stopped. The wedding portrait caught her eye immediately, not because of the couple, though they were striking, but because of the bouquet. Denise had studied Victorian flower symbolism as part of her research. She knew that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, flowers were often used to send messages, a practice called floriography. But the flowers in this bride's hands were unusual. They were not the typical roses, lilies, and orange blossoms that appeared in most wedding portraits of the era. These flowers were specific, intentional, strange: red amaranth, white oleander, yellow acacia, blue salvia. Denise's heart began to beat faster. She had seen references to these flowers before, not in wedding manuals or etiquette guides, but in the coded communications of a secret network that had operated in the South during the darkest years of Jim Crow. She leaned closer to her screen, studying the bride's face. "Who were you?" Denise whispered. "And what were you trying to say?" Denise spent the next week immersed in research, pulling together everything she could find about floral codes used by black communities in the post-Reconstruction South. What she discovered was remarkable. After the end of slavery, African Americans in the South had developed elaborate systems of covert communication. Some were verbal, coded spirituals, double-meaning phrases, warnings disguised as gossip. Others were visual, symbols chalked on fence posts, patterns in quilts hung on clotheslines, and arrangements of flowers placed in windows or carried in plain sight. These codes had roots in the Underground Railroad, but they evolved in the decades that followed, adapting to new dangers. The period from 1890 to 1920 was one of the bloodiest in American history for black citizens. Lynchings were common, often sparked by nothing more than a rumor or a white person's wounded pride. Entire communities could be destroyed in a single night of violence. In this climate of terror, information was survival. Knowing when to flee, where to hide, and who could be trusted meant the difference between life and death. Denise found references to a network that operated across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, a loose confederation of churches, families, and community leaders who passed warnings and coordinated escapes. They called themselves the Gardeners, and their primary method of communication was flowers. Each flower had a specific meaning. Red amaranth meant danger, leave immediately. White oleander meant the path is clear. Yellow acacia meant trust this person. Blue salvia meant message received, help is coming. A bouquet combining all four flowers would send a powerful message. There is danger, but the path is clear. Trust the bearer. Help is on the way. Denise stared at the wedding photograph again. The bride was holding exactly that combination. This was not a bouquet, it was a signal. But who was the bride signaling? And what danger was she warning about? Denise knew she needed more information. The photograph alone could not tell her the full story. She needed names, dates, context. She returned to the archives and requested access to the full collection from the minister's estate. 3 days later, she sat in a climate-controlled reading room, surrounded by boxes of documents that smelled of age and dust. The minister's name was Reverend Isaiah, and he had led a Baptist church in rural Georgia from 1925 until his death in 1984. His papers included sermons, church bulletins, and personal correspondence, decades of a life dedicated to faith and community. But buried among the official documents were older items, passed down from previous generations, letters from the early 1900s, photographs of people long dead. and a small leather journal, its pages brittle and faded. Denise opened the journal carefully. The handwriting inside was elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time. The first entry was dated March 3rd, 1910. My name is Bessie. I'm writing this so that someone will know the truth, even if I cannot speak it aloud. The danger is coming closer. We have received word that they are looking for my sister Ruth. I do not know what she did or did not do, but it does not matter. When they come for one of us, guilt is decided before the trial. There is no trial. There is only rope and fire. Denise's hands trembled as she turned the pages. We have made a plan. Ruth will leave tonight. The gardeners have prepared the way, but I must stay behind. I am to be married in 3 months, and my wedding will be the signal. The flowers I carry will tell everyone who sees the photograph. Ruth is gone. The path was clear. She's safe. Denise looked at the wedding portrait again. The bride's name was Bessie, and her bouquet was a message to an entire network, confirming that her sister had escaped. But escaped from what? The journal revealed the full horror of what had happened in the spring of 1910. Bessie's sister Ruth had worked as a seamstress for a white family in town, the only employment available to black women that paid more than field labor. She was skilled, quiet, and careful. She knew the rules of survival in the Jim Crow South. Never look a white person in the eye, never speak unless spoken to, never give anyone a reason to notice you. But none of that mattered when the family's teenage son accused Ruth of stealing a silver brooch. Ruth had not stolen anything. The brooch was later found in the son's own room, hidden beneath his mattress, but by then it was too late. The accusation had been made. Word spread through the white community like wildfire, growing more distorted with each telling. Within days, the story had transformed from theft to something far worse. Whispers of improper behavior, of a black woman who had forgotten her place. A group of white men began gathering in the evenings, drinking and talking about teaching a lesson. Bessie heard about it from a sympathetic white shopkeeper who had always treated the black community fairly. The shopkeeper's warning was blunt. Get your sister out of town tonight. They're coming for her tomorrow. Or, that night, Ruth vanished. The gardeners had arranged everything. A wagon waiting at the edge of town, safe houses along the route north, contacts in Atlanta who would help her board a train to Chicago. Within a week, Ruth was beyond the reach of the men who wanted to kill her. But the danger was not over. The mob was furious that their target had escaped. They demanded answers. Someone must have helped her. Someone must know where she went. Bessie's family was questioned, threatened. Their home was searched, but they revealed nothing. The code held. 3 months later, Bessie married James, a deacon in Reverend Isaiah's father's church, and she walked down the aisle carrying a bouquet that told the entire network. The mission was complete. Ruth was safe. The gardeners had succeeded. Denise continued reading the journal, and with each page, the scope of the gardeners' network became clearer. Bessie had not been merely a passive participant. She had been a key member of the organization, using her position as a respected young woman in the community to gather information and coordinate escapes. The journal documented dozens of operations over the years, men and women who had been spirited away in the night, warned of impending violence, or hidden until the danger passed. Some had been accused of crimes they did not commit. Others had simply attracted the wrong kind of attention. A black man who had been too successful in his business. A black woman who had rejected the advances of a white employer. The gardeners operated with military precision. They had scouts who monitored white gatherings for signs of trouble. They had safe houses spaced along routes to the north. They had contacts in cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and Detroit who could provide jobs and housing for those who escaped. And they communicated through flowers. Each arrangement was a sentence in a silent language. Red amaranth appeared in windows when danger was imminent. White oleander was placed on graves to signal that a route was clear. Yellow acacia was woven into wreaths to identify trusted allies. Blue salvia was carried at funerals, weddings, and church events to confirm that messages had been received. To outsiders, these were simply decorations, the natural expressions of a community that loved beauty and celebration. But to those who knew the code, they were a lifeline. Denise realized that the wedding photograph was not just a personal memento. It was a historical document, evidence of a resistance movement that had operated in plain sight for decades, and it was only the beginning of what she would discover. Denise knew she needed to find the living descendants of Bessie and her family. The archives could only tell her so much. If she wanted to understand the full story, she needed to speak with people who had inherited the memories. She began tracing the genealogy, following the branches of the family tree through census records, marriage certificates, and obituaries. Reverend Isaiah, whose collection had contained the photograph, turned out to be Bessie's grandson, the son of her eldest daughter. From there, Denise found living relatives scattered across the country, in Georgia and Chicago and California. She reached out to them one by one, explaining her research and asking if they would be willing to share their family stories. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, Denise was inundated with letters, emails, and phone calls. Many of the descendants had heard fragments of the story, whispered references to the old days, to family members who had gone north, to a network that had kept people safe during dangerous times, but no one had ever put all the pieces together. One call stood out above the others. It came from a woman named Gloria, who lived in Chicago. She was 91 years old, and she had information that Denise desperately needed. "I knew Bessie," Gloria said, her voice thin but clear. "She was my grandmother, and I know about the flowers. She taught me when I was a girl before she died. She said it was important to remember, even if we hoped we would never need to use it again." Denise flew to Chicago the following week. She sat in Gloria's living room, surrounded by family photographs that spanned nearly a century, and listened as the old woman told her story. "The bouquet in that wedding picture saved my great-aunt Ruth's life," Gloria said. "But it also nearly destroyed our family, because the white men who wanted Ruth never stopped looking for answers." Gloria's story revealed a chapter of the family history that had never been written down, a chapter too painful and too dangerous to commit to paper. After Ruth's escape, the mob's fury had turned toward those left behind. They could not prove that Bessie's family had helped Ruth disappear, but they did not need proof. Suspicion was enough. Over the following months, the family faced a campaign of terror. Their barn was burned, their livestock was killed. Threatening notes were left on their doorstep. James, Bessie's new husband, was beaten by a group of masked men who warned him to keep his wife in line. But the family did not break. They did not flee. They stayed, and they continued their work with the Gardners, even as the danger grew. "My grandmother used to say that leaving would have been a betrayal," Gloria explained. "They had built something important, a way to save lives. If they ran, who would take their place? Who would carry the flowers?" The persecution continued for years, but gradually it faded. The white men who had wanted Ruth grew old or moved away. New concerns replaced old grudges, and the family survived, quietly continuing their work, never speaking of it to outsiders. Bessie lived until 1967. She was 90 years old when she died, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In her final years, she had begun teaching the flower code to the youngest generation, not because she expected them to need it, but because she believed that memory was sacred. "She said that the flowers were our ancestors' gift to us," Gloria said, tears streaming down her face, "a way of protecting each other when no one else would. She made me promise to remember, and I have. All my life I have remembered." But what had happened to Ruth, the sister whose escape had sparked everything? Denise asked Gloria if she knew, and the old woman smiled. "Ruth lived," she said simply. "She lived a long, full life." The Gardners Network had brought Ruth safely to Chicago in the spring of 1910. She arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and the address of a contact who could help her find work. Within a year, she had established herself as a seamstress, using the skills that had once put her in danger to build a new life. She married a man named William, a Pullman porter who traveled the country by rail. They had 4 children together. Ruth never returned to Georgia. It was too dangerous. The men who had wanted to kill her had long memories, and she knew that her presence would only bring trouble to the family she had left behind. But she found other ways to stay connected. Letters were too risky, so she sent messages through the network. Flowers delivered by trusted couriers, each arrangement carrying news of her health, her happiness, her growing family. Bessie received these messages and responded in kind, and the 2 sisters maintained a silent conversation that lasted for decades. They finally saw each other again in 1952, when the last of the men who had threatened them was dead and buried. Ruth traveled to Georgia for a family reunion, walking into her sister's home after 42 years of separation. Gloria had been a teenager then. She remembered the moment vividly. "They just held each other and cried," she said. "No words, just tears. And then my grandmother pulled out a bouquet she had prepared, the same flowers from her wedding portrait, all those years ago. She gave it to Ruth and said, 'You're finally home.'" Denise published her research the following year, and the story of Bessie, Ruth, and the Gardners captured national attention. Historians praised the discovery as a significant contribution to the understanding of black resistance during the Jim Crow era. The photograph of Bessie's wedding was reproduced in newspapers, magazines, and academic journals around the world. What had once been an overlooked image in an archive became a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and survival. But for the descendants of the family, the impact was more personal. Denise organized a reunion, bringing together relatives from both branches of the family, the descendants of Bessie, who had stayed in Georgia, and the descendants of Ruth, who had built new lives in the North. More than 100 people gathered in Atlanta on a warm spring day, meeting cousins they had never known, hearing stories they had never been told. Gloria, now 92, addressed the gathering. "Our grandmothers and great-grandmothers lived in a time when loving each other was an act of resistance," she said. "They could not march in the streets or vote at the ballot box, but they could carry flowers. They could send messages. They could save each other's lives one secret signal at a time. That is our inheritance. That is who we are." The family decided to establish a foundation in Bessie and Ruth's names, dedicated to preserving the history of black resistance movements and supporting communities affected by racial violence. The logo they chose featured 4 flowers: red amaranth, white oleander, yellow acacia, and blue salvia, arranged in a circle. The secret language of the Gardners had become a public symbol of hope. On the anniversary of Bessie's wedding, June 14th, 112 years after she had walked down the aisle with a coated bouquet in her hands, the family gathered at her grave in rural Georgia. The headstone was simple, weathered by more than half a century of rain and sun, but the family had added something new, a bronze plaque engraved with the 4 flowers of the Gardner's Code. One by one, the descendants placed fresh flowers on the grave. Real red amaranth, real white oleander, real yellow acacia, real blue salvia. The arrangement was identical to the one Bessie had carried in 1910. A young woman named Maya, one of Ruth's great-great-granddaughters, read a letter she had written for the occasion. "Dear Bessie," she began, "you never met me, but I am here because of you. Because you chose to stay when it would have been safer to run. Because you carried flowers that told my great-great-grandmother the path was clear. Because you kept the secret for 60 years, until it was safe for your sister to come home. I am the proof that your sacrifice mattered. My children will be the proof, and their children after them. The message you sent has been received, not just by Ruth, but by all of us. We hear you, we remember you, and we will carry your flowers forward." The wind stirred the blossoms on the grave, scattering petals across the grass. For a moment it seemed as if the photograph had come to life. The bride in her white dress, the bouquet in her hands, her eyes no longer solemn but shining with joy. A century of silence had ended. A secret written in flowers had finally been read by the whole world. Some photographs capture a moment, but some photographs carry a message across time, waiting for the right person to understand. Bessie's message had been received, and it would never be forgotten.